China blames the U.S. for a close encounter, and advocates fight for funding to help vets experiencing homelessness. All of that and more today, June 1st, 2023. Good morning, Early Birds. I'm Zimone Perez, and this is the Early Bird Brief, produced by Defense News and Military Times. First up, the past couple days have been marked by tension after the U.S. said a Chinese fighter jet flew, quote, aggressively close to an American aircraft. This week, the military released video of the incident over the South China Sea. The Chinese J-16 fighter pilot flew directly in front of the nose of the RC-135 on Friday, according to the U.S. military. At the time, the aircraft was conducting routine operations in international airspace. The U.S. military said the maneuver forced the American pilot to fly through the turbulent wake. Beijing responded to U.S. complaints yesterday, demanding an end to such flights in that airspace. U.S. defense leaders have complained that China's military has become significantly more aggressive over the past 5 years. China has continued to intercept U.S. aircraft and ships in the region. Here's why it matters. Tensions with China have grown in recent months. Washington and Beijing are at odds over a number of issues. China protests U.S. military aid and weapons being sent to Taiwan. The U.S. continues to conduct freedom of navigation exercises in the South China Sea, even though China claims it as its sole territory. Other South China Sea nations are also challenging China over its claims as well, and sometimes the tension peaks. Countries like the Philippines, Malaysia, and Vietnam transit the South China Sea freely. An estimated $5 trillion in global trade transits the sea each year. And we all can't forget that just a couple months ago, U.S. fighter jets shot down a suspected Chinese spy balloon after it flew across the continental United States. Military-to-military contacts between the U.S. and China have all but evaporated in recent years amid a historic decline in governmental relations. That's even as trade and personal exchanges remain strong. Tensions are not expected to end anytime soon. China said its defense chief will not meet with U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin when the two men attend a security conference in Singapore this weekend. And just a note, we have two important stories ahead. The first deals with sexual assault reporting, and the second with suicide prevention regulations. Both may contain details that are difficult for some listeners to hear. First, Wisconsin lawmakers are considering legislation that would tighten prohibitions on sexual assault within the state's National Guard. This came after a federal report found commanders had been flouting federal requirements for handling complaints. A committee made up of legislators, district attorneys, and military veterans began working on the legislation last summer. They wanted to tighten oversight of sexual assault complaints within the Wisconsin National Guard. The State Assembly's Military Affairs Committee began the process toward floor votes with a public hearing on the bills yesterday. The National Guard Bureau in Washington, D.C. released a report in December 2019, and it found that Wisconsin National Guard commanders between 2009 and 2019 improperly kept sexual assault complaints to themselves instead of sending them to the National Guard Bureau for investigation. Wisconsin National Guard Commander Major General Donald Dunbar resigned just as the report was released. The probe began as U.S. Senator Tammy Baldwin received complaints in 2018 that high-ranking officers were doing little to address sexual harassment and assault complaints dating back to 2002. The report found that commanders launched internal investigations rather than refer complaints to local police and the National Bureau. Those actions contradict Defense Department regulations. According to the report, they also used poorly trained investigators who sometimes falsely presented themselves as Bureau investigators. And they also reportedly failed to track complaints or enter them in a Defense Department database. And they didn't note substantiated sexual offenses in evaluation reports. The legislation the committee developed would clarify that civilian authorities have primary jurisdiction to prosecute sexual assault, sexual misconduct, and other crimes committed by Wisconsin National Guard members. It also would adopt provisions from the Uniform Code of Military Justice prohibiting officers and recruiters from engaging in prohibited sexual activity with soldiers they're training or applicants for military service. Consent would not be a viable legal defense. In other news, the Army has yet to provide a standard for how the service works to prevent suicides and respond to them. For more on this waiting, Senior Army Times reporter Davis Winke sits down with us. So, Davis, our Senior Army Times reporter extraordinaire, thank you for sitting down with the podcast today.
Thanks for having me, Z.
So, what is the current situation with the suicide prevention regulation within the Army?
The Army is still yet to release a dedicated regulation on suicide prevention. This is something that's been in the works for a long time, but attention is on it again after a military.com investigation revealed that a soldier with the 1st Infantry Division stationed at Fort Riley, Kansas, after he survived a suicide attempt while on a rotation in Poland, this soldier came back home and unfortunately didn't have much in the way of supervision and care, it seems, from his chain of command back at Fort Riley, and he died by completed suicide 30 days after his initial attempt. And that's put new focus on what the service's practices are for standardizing the way that units respond to, suicide attempts, suicide ideation, or in the cases of completed suicides, how are they going to work to prevent the next within a unit and prevent suicide contagion?
And so there's been some delays reported in rolling out this actual firm plan. So what is the service saying the causes of these delays are?
First, I'll give a quick rundown of the timeline of how we got here. We at Army Times have been hammering on this for a little bit now, but back in late 2020, the Army told CBS News in response to an investigation that they were working on a dedicated regulation for suicide prevention. Why is this important? Well, Army regulations are the way that the service really standardizes and sets responsibilities and holds people accountable for failing to meet their formal responsibilities when it comes to implementing a program, complying with policy, complying with laws, etc. If you're a young NCO looking for the answer on something, such as what's an appropriate hairstyle for my troop, you're going to look towards Army Regulation 670-1, dress and appearance. And there just isn't a centralized equivalent for suicide prevention. So in the fall of 2020, they promised that one was forthcoming. The next year, in September of 21, they said, it'll be here in a couple of months. Then a couple months later, they said, no, it'll be here the first quarter of calendar 2022. Then in April of 2022, the Army told me, actually, it's got to come by the end of the summer. And then once that came and went yet again, they said, it'll come by the end of 2022. And then once more, they have quietly pushed what their self-imposed deadline is all the way out to June of this year. And the reason for these delays is hard to pin down. But really what it boils down to is bureaucratic hell, for lack of a better way to put it. When you have a program like suicide prevention that cuts across so many different functions within the service, such as the Army Resilience Directorate, the military health system, your chaplains, your counselors, your commanders, command policy, Congress, law, all of these different stakeholders at play, you've got to really be careful about how you synchronize, assign, and enforce responsibilities within a program like this. And regulations are authoritative. Once it's set out via regulation, that's the way it is until you change the reg. So they were being careful about that and making sure that they did everything right. That's what they were telling me last year around this time. But now their line is that they're continuing to refine it, partially because they need to make sure it aligns with the recommendations of a Pentagon-level independent review committee that recently put out a report with voluminous recommendations on how to address the suicide epidemic within the force. It just seems like bureaucratic delay after bureaucratic delay keeps mounting here, and meanwhile, you've got units that are trying to navigate a disparate set of resources that live in different places online.
One final thing, what are the rank and file saying about this?
I've talked with some junior leaders, the people who are most likely to be at the leading edge of suicide prevention, the people who are most likely to notice that something's wrong with one of their soldiers, the ones who are most likely to bear the brunt of integrating a soldier back into the force in the event that they survive a suicide attempt and return. It's these junior leaders that are really going to make or break suicide prevention. And a lot of them are just not certain what they're supposed to do and when, given the current state of Army policy and resources when it comes to suicide prevention. Even though sometimes a regulation and pitting more responsibilities on people can do more harm than good in some cases, where you've got folks worrying about how to cover their backs and make sure that things are complied with, at a baseline level, these soldiers just want an authoritative place where they can quickly turn to find answers on what they should be doing and when. And even if it's not the perfect answer, it gives them a starting point to work from with their superiors and subordinates. And they just want more guidance. That's what they're looking for here.
A lot remains to be seen, it sounds like. Davis, thank you for joining the pod today.
Thanks, Z. Have a good one.
Thank you for your reporting, Davis. If you or a loved one is experiencing thoughts of self-harm or suicide, assistance is available through the Military Veterans Crisis Line. Call 988 and press 1, or you can text a number at 838-255. Also on your radar for today, advocates are struggling to help veterans experiencing homelessness as COVID-19 funding ends. Veterans advocates are scrambling to fix funding and programming shortfalls. Those were caused by the expiration of pandemic assistance for homeless veterans earlier this month. It's a problem advocates believe could be avoided with a quick vote by Congress. But plans to extend the extra relief are still stalled in the House and Senate due to the debt limit fight and other federal budget talks. The delay has the potential to undo some of the progress made in recent years in reducing homelessness among veterans. Many federal emergency authorities created to help address issues during quarantine ended when the national emergency due to the pandemic ended May 11th. The list included several services targeted specifically at veterans experiencing homelessness or at risk of losing stable shelter. That included free rides to VA clinics, access to telehealth medical services, and increased financial assistance for rent costs. Veterans Affairs officials had lobbied alongside advocates to extend those protections beyond the May 11 date. Daily support stipends dropped by more than half in some regions and left nonprofits scrambling to find new money or new housing options for veterans. Democratic and Republican lawmakers have said they are still working on the issue. Supporters are hopeful the issue can be revived once the debt limit fight is settled and the fiscal 2024 budget work resumes. But for now, they're left with less money next month to deal with the same problems they faced last month. The Department of Housing and Urban Development late last year announced that the number of vets experiencing homelessness sank more than 11% from the start of 2020 to early 2022. That is a significant decrease after several years of limited progress. Advocates attributed that success in part to expanded focus and funding during the early days of the pandemic in the United States. But the positive HUD report still estimates that there are 33,000 vets without stable shelter on any given night. Housing experts worry that without adequate resources, that number could be higher this year. And now, here are some other stories that we're hearing chirps about. Our team at Marine Corps Times is reporting that President Joe Biden wants General Eric Smith to be the new Commandant of the Marine Corps. General David Berger is set to retire in July. The Associated Press is reporting that a new $300 million U.S. aid package to Ukraine will include drone ammunition. And Colorado Newsline is reporting that graduating cadets at the Air Force Academy are preparing for a commencement address by President Joe Biden. And on this day in history, in 1990, the United States and the Soviet Union agreed to end the production of chemical weapons. U.S. President George H.W. Bush and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev met in Washington to sign the agreement. The two leaders also agreed to decrease their stockpiles of chemical weapons by 80%. That's it for us this morning. To get more top stories and breaking news, go to defensenews.com/EBB to subscribe to the Early Bird Brief newsletter. If you liked what you heard, give us a like wherever you get your podcasts. And be sure to follow us on social media @defense_news and @militarytimes. Also, please rate us and be sure to leave a comment. Today's Early Bird Brief is hosted and produced by me, Simone Z. Perez. Today's episode features stories by the Associated Press, Davis Winke, and Leo Shane III. Our editor-in-chief is Mike Bruce. Have a great day.